Well, External Affairs Minister Dr. Jaishankar is addressing the 80th session of the UNGA at the UN headquarters in New York. Let's take you there live.
Madam President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Namaskar from the people of Bharat. We are gathered here 8 decades since the founding of this unique body. The UN Charter calls on us not just to prevent war, but to build peace, not just to defend rights, but to uphold the dignity of every human being. It challenges us to stand as good neighbors, uniting our strength so that generations to come inherit a world of justice, of progress, and of lasting freedom. Madam President, forces unleashed by history since the founding of the UN propelled this body forward. As decolonization advanced, the world began to return to its natural diversity. The membership of the United Nations quadrupled, and the organization's role and remit grew significantly. In the era of globalization, its agenda evolved even further. Development goals took center stage, even as climate change emerged as a shared priority. Trade acquired greater prominence, while food and health access were recognized as essential to global well-being. Where security was concerned, the UN undertook peacekeeping operations and promoted disarmament discussions. As a result, the UN became a natural platform to debate key global issues. Madam President, we must ask ourselves today, how has the UN lived up to expectations? And just look at the state of the world. There are 2 significant conflicts underway, one in Ukraine and the other in the Middle East, West Asia. Innumerable other hotspots don't even make the news. The slow progress of the SDG Agenda 2030 presents a sorry picture. On climate change, the reality is of recirculated commitments and creative accounting. If climate action itself is questioned, what hope is there for climate justice? When a once-in-a-century pandemic hits us, we saw open discrimination in access to vaccines and to travel. Energy and food security have been the first casualties of conflict and disruption, especially since 2022. Better off societies insulated themselves by having the first call. The resource-stressed ones scrambled to survive, only to hear sanctimonious lectures thereafter. When it came to trade, non-market practices gamed rules and regimes. The resulting concentration exposed the world to leveraging. On top of that, we now see tariff volatility and uncertain market access. As a result, de-risking is a growing compulsion, whether from limited sources of supply or over-dependence on a particular market. Economic concerns have other dimensions as well. Heightened technology control is one. The grip on supply chains and critical minerals is another. The shaping of connectivity is no less sensitive. Protection of key sea lanes has become a challenge. Restricting the evolution of a global workplace is an issue. Each makes a compelling case for more international cooperation, not less. But are we really headed in that direction? And where has the UN actually made a difference? Madam President, as members of the UN, we meet here as sovereign equals. That is not a formalism, but a recognition of the inherent diversity of our world. Understandably, we have different history, traditions, heritage, and culture. For them to coexist, for them to enrich each other, it is imperative that we foster understanding and respect. This will only happen when we resist political interference and economic pressures, when narratives are free of prejudice, when double standards are abjured, and when pluralism is truly appreciated. Madam President, Excellencies, while asserting our rights, we must also firmly face up to threats. Countering terrorism is a particular priority because it synthesizes bigotry, violence, intolerance, and fear. India has confronted this challenge since independence, having a neighbor that is an epicenter of global terrorism. For decades now, major international terrorist attacks are traced back to that one country. UN's designated lists of terrorists are replete with its nationals. The most recent example of cross-border barbarism was the murder of innocent tourists in Pahalgam in April this year. India exercised its right to defend its people against terrorism and brought its organizers and perpetrators to justice. Because terrorism is a shared threat, Madam President, it is essential that there is much deeper international cooperation. When nations openly declare terrorism a state policy, when terror hubs operate on an industrial scale, when terrorists are publicly glorified, then such actions must be unequivocally condemned. The financing of terrorism must be choked, even as prominent terrorists are sanctioned. Relentless pressure must be applied on the entire terrorism ecosystem. Those who condone nations that sponsor terror will find that it comes back to bite them. Madam President, an objective report card will show that the UN is in a state of crisis. When peace is under threat from conflicts, when development is derailed by lack of resources, when human rights are violated by terrorism, the UN remains gridlocked. As its ability to forge common ground diminishes, belief in multilateralism also recedes. Central to the erosion of the UN's credibility has been resistance to reform. Most members strongly desire change, but the process is being made an obstacle to the outcome. It is imperative that we see through this cynicism and purposefully address the reform agenda. The historical injustice done to Africa should be redressed. Both permanent and non-permanent membership of the Council must be expanded. A reformed Council must be truly representative, and India stands ready to assume greater responsibilities. Madam President, today the predicament of the Global South is especially acute. Bharat, under the leadership of Prime Minister Narendra Modi, believes that it has both a duty to contribute and an obligation to motivate. That is why we have undertaken more than 600 major development projects in 78 countries, as well as innumerable community-based initiatives. They range from large infrastructure to small livelihoods, from capacity building to people's welfare, from concrete assets to education and training. Turbulent times require that we step forward during moments of crisis. India has been forthcoming in that regard, especially in its immediate vicinity. Whether it is finance, food, fertilizer, or fuel, we have responded to the urgent requirements of our neighbors. Madam President, climate events and conflicts have created a demand for HADR assistance. Reflecting our growing capabilities, Bharat has endeavored to be a first responder. Be it essential medicines or relief supplies, the operations of a field hospital or limb fitment camps, these efforts covered 19 nations last year. The people of Afghanistan and those of Myanmar saw India extend its hand during recent earthquakes. Our efforts at ensuring safe commerce, combating piracy, and preventing attacks on shipping in the Northern Arabian Sea also bear mention. And the Indian tradition of UN peacekeeping operations continues in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in Western Sahara, Central African Republic, Golan Heights, Cyprus, Lebanon, Abyei, South Sudan, and Somalia. To put it clearly, our soldiers ensure peacekeeping, our sailors protect maritime shipping, our security counters terrorism, our doctors and teachers facilitate human development the world over, our industry produces affordable products, our techies promote digitization, and our training facilities are open to the world. These remain the core of our foreign policy. Madam President, each one of us has the opportunity of contributing to peace and prosperity. In the case of conflicts, especially Ukraine and Gaza, even those not directly involved have felt its impact. Nations who can engage all sides must step up in the search for solutions. India calls for an end to hostilities and will support any initiative that will help restore peace. The last decade in Bharat has also seen transformative changes due to the vision of Prime Minister Modi. Our digital public infrastructure has redefined governance and enabled delivery of public services on an unprecedented scale. Our startup ecosystem, innovation culture, and microfinance are changing the face of society. Our rapidly growing infrastructure facilitates both ease of doing business and ease of living for citizens. India remains committed to sharing its experiences and tools with others on their journey of development. Artificial intelligence as a horizontal and cross-cutting technology has a particular promise for development. India's approach is to harness it responsibly for human welfare. Inclusion and impact will be the watchwords for the summit that India will host in 2026. Madam President, Bharat approaches the contemporary world guided by three key concepts. One, Atmanirbharta, or self-reliance. That means developing our own capabilities, building our own strengths, and nurturing our own talent. We see its results already, be it in manufacturing, in space programs, in pharma production, or in digital applications. Make, innovate, and design in India also benefit the world. Two, Atma Raksha, or securing oneself. We remain determined to protect our people and secure their interests at home and abroad. That means zero tolerance for terrorism, robust defense of our borders, forging partnerships beyond, and assisting our community abroad. And 3, Atma Vishwas, or self-confidence. As the most populous nation, as a civilizational state, as a rapidly growing major economy, we are confident about who we are and what we will be. Bharat will always maintain its freedom of choice and will always be a voice of the Global South. Madam President, these are certainly challenging times for the international community. Many of our assumptions and expectations no longer hold. In such circumstances, it is imperative to stay strong, to hold firm, and to deepen friendships. International cooperation must prevail because islands of prosperity cannot flourish in an ocean of turbulence. A world order requires common purpose, as it does empathy for others. That is where we look to the United Nations. Madam President, every member who can make this world a better place must have the opportunity to do their utmost. And for that to happen, reformed multilateralism is the obvious way. The 9th decade of the UN must be one of leadership and hope. Bharat will do its fair share and more. I thank you.
Well, you heard the External Affairs Minister, Dr. S. Jaishankar, addressing the 88th session of the UN General Assembly there at the UN headquarters in New York, presenting India's vision for the world, where he initially painted a picture of how the world is right now, of course, surrounded by a lot of conflict and differences as well, where India's vision has given the alternative to how the situation, the prevailing situation, could be addressed. India has been doing its own bit to do it, but it's also looking to the UN to add to the efforts that are being made, which can go a long way if the kind of reforms that India has been advocating for, along with some other nations, are undertaken. For more, let me go across to former senior diplomat J.S. Mukul. He's with us to talk about it. What was your impression about the kind of address that the External Affairs Minister delivered at the 80th UNGA General Session?
Well, I think firstly, it was a very wide-ranging speech. It touched on all aspects, and I think he covered all the bases that are required to be covered in the short time that is allotted to each speaker at the high-level segment of the UNGA. He started off by recalling what the UN Charter 8 decades ago was meant to be, and traced how it was to work. But then soon he came to asking the questions where the UN has actually fulfilled the roles. And obviously, by pointing to examples, he alluded to the fact that the UN has come up short in many areas. That again led him to the concept of reformed multilateralism, the need that UN has to reform in order to be relevant to the times. And therein, of course, he specifically referred to India's stated and traditional position of reform of the UN, starting with the reform of the UN Security Council in both its permanent and non-permanent members, and clearly reiterating the fact that India stands ready to take additional responsibilities. He also referred in this context to the discrimination or the lack of adequate representation faced by the Africans. So yes, and then of course went on after that to refer to the main areas where UN which UN has to address. In that context, he pointed out the challenges that we are faced with, particularly the two wars he referred to, in addition to the various other hotspots. So the problem with regard to Ukraine and West Asia, and there again he said that countries need to address this, and India stands ready to do its bit. Uh, he also talked of the challenges in other areas. For example, during the pandemic, how countries of the global south had been discriminated against with regard to vaccine. He referred to the problem of climate change. He talked of food, fertilizer, energy security. I mean, as I said, a very wide ranging and an excellent presentation or address to the, as is supposed to be, painting the larger picture of covering all the bases that need to be covered, and in that pointing out India's position. One last major point, of course, was the special focus on terrorism, where he clearly alluded to a neighboring country being the epicenter of terrorism, and how the world knows it, and this has been the fact. And in that context, how India had been at the receiving end, and the heinous terror attack that happened in Pahalgam, and clearly reiterating that there is zero tolerance for terrorism. This also, of course, is in the context of the Pakistan Prime Minister's statement, which had tried to paint a false narrative on these issues. So, yes, a very wide ranging speech. And then, of course, he concluded on a high note by referring to the three concepts that India stands for: Atmanirbhar, Atma Raksha, and Atma Vishwas. I think, from my perspective, it couldn't have been packed in those 10, 12, 15 minutes, whatever it was. And as I said, the big picture speech, a very comprehensive, covering all bases and covering a large number of issues, and giving a lot of food for thought to the audience.
Yes, definitely. My colleague Amritpal Singh is also with us now. Amrit, in terms of putting across the kind of things that India has been doing, when you look at what the world really needs in terms of being resilient, facing all the kind of circumstances that India itself had to place after the pandemic, and then, of course, taking on the challenges that India intrinsically has in terms of the kind of economic challenges that it has had in the past as well, dealing with poverty and then turning things around there as well, bringing people, 200 million people out of poverty as well. Do you think that is also something that clearly demonstrates, and which is what the External Affairs Minister tried to put across, that India can be a living example of how problems can be solved?
That's right, Gautam. The External Affairs Minister was very clear that how India overcame its challenges, how India is still overcoming its challenges, when he referred to, the three mantras of looking at self-reliance, looking at Atmanirbharta, securing oneself, and self-confidence, where he said that they will follow their own choices, be the voice of the global south, essentially sending a message that not only India has demonstrated how these developmental challenges can be met by India's example, but India's ready to share its experience, and not just preach from the pulpit, but India's actually been first responder in especially in its neighborhood. He referred to how India was the first responder in earthquakes in Afghanistan and Myanmar, how India provided medicines, how India provided vaccines, how India undertakes infrastructure projects, from education, Indian techies giving digital support, how India has built its own digital public infrastructure, and is extending help to many African countries, countries of Asia, especially in India's neighborhood. So saying that it's not just the world can learn from India's experiences, also India is ready to share them and has demonstrated a resilience. And India has emerged, and he said, as a voice of the global south, where the aspirations and the concerns of the global south need to be factored in to the global governance architecture if UN wishes to remain relevant and solve the problems of the majority of the population of the world which resides in the developing countries. So the External Affairs Minister sending a very clear message saying India is committed to uplifting humanity out of the crisis, be it economic crisis, be it the crisis of trade linkages, be it the crisis of facing global challenges, right from climate change to, as Ambassador was saying, terrorism, and also the abysmal progress that the world has made on SDGs. He referred to all that, and he kind of showed, he once again reiterated India's commitment to development, and development not just of India or not just of nations acting as islands of prosperity, but actually sharing that with the rest of the world, that part of the world which may not be as developed or may not be as better placed, or in a position which developed countries find themselves in. Gautam?
Certainly, certainly. Very quickly, I just also wanted to ask you about the situation where India has been putting out a larger message as well, where India's engagements, especially the external affairs minister's engagements, are concerned in New York this time around on the sidelines of the event today. Earlier, Ambassador Mukul, he was, as part of the foreign ministers meeting of BRICS, he put out a message about protectionism as well, although that was not in the content in this particular speech. But that is again an issue that the world has been confronted with all of a sudden, and then of course India has taken a position on that too.
Yeah, in this speech also there was a tangential reference to the trade barriers and things like that, which I think was a pointed message with regard to the tariffs and the sanctions that we are facing. But you're right, it was more came out even more clearly in the earlier BRICS meeting on the sidelines of the UNGA. So yes, it is very clear that, and in fact, we always know that the sideline meetings, both bilateral and multilateral, are very important. EAM has held many bilateral meetings and a number of multilateral meetings. There was the BRICS meeting, there was also the IPSA meeting, there was the SICA meeting, and so on and so forth, and I'm sure there will be more. So yes, those meetings are important because there it is even clearer. The messages come out even stronger because those are full meetings of like-minded countries on particular issues. So yes, the point about protectionism was a clear message to the kind of unilateral, unjustified sanctions and trade measures, trade barriers, both tariff barriers and non-tariff barriers that we have been facing, and also the kind of secondary sanctions that have been imposed, unilateral sanctions. And in this speech also he referred to the fact that there should be no double standards in such areas. So that I think is also very important. India's larger message, as you rightly pointed out, needs to be read. I mean, this speech is important, the address to the UNGA, but also in terms of what is coming out from the sideline events.
Well, certainly. And Amrit, if you look at how things are progressing these days, well, it's the opposite of progress really, because we saw how the External Affairs Minister talked about two conflicts, major conflicts raging across the world, and it seems that we're heading in the direction of perhaps another one where Iran is concerned.
That's right. He referred to explicitly to the ongoing conflicts in Europe and in West Asia, and he said that those countries not even directly associated with it or have been impacted due to the volatility it has created in the global supply chains. And he said there are numerous other conflicts which are going on in the world, which don't even find a mention at the global stage. So he did refer to the conflicts affecting them, and he pointed out that UN's credibility is at stake unless it reforms itself and asserts multilateralism. He talked about reformed multilateralism and the relevance of the UN in responding to these conflicts, because he was very clear that India is ready to take a bigger responsibility. He talked about reform. He talked about not just India, but he talked about Africa being included in it. So saying that India's, when he talked about the peacekeeping UN peacekeeping force, he talked about how India is contributing to maintaining peace in various war-torn countries like South Sudan. The UN peacekeeping forces are placed at Golan Heights, at in Cyprus, etc. So he called the world to respond as a voice of reason and not in act in in very myopic interests that individual countries may have or certain blocs may have. So he called for a reform of the UN and warned the UN that the very credibility of the UN is at stake. He said during major crises, his own words, the UN remained in a gridlock in responding or resolving these situations. So clearly, by giving the example of India, how India is maintaining peace, how India contributed to food security and responded in terms of crisis by actually the Indian sailors out on the high seas, giving maritime security, saying that the UN as a body needs to, move forward in that direction if peace and tranquility has to be maintained in the world. Gautam?
Is that possible, Ambassador Mukul, in a scenario where we have somebody like Donald Trump, the head of the United States, which is the largest contributor to the UN's financial resources, cutting back funding to the UN, and the UN's role in conflict resolution anywhere in the world much diminished, compared to its halcyon days? Do you think UN will be a more effective tool if it's reformed the way that India has been advocating, or is that too much to expect?
Well, the clear intention has been expressed. You're absolutely right. Countries have to step up to the plate because UN is a multilateral global body. And therein, of course, the largest contributor has been the United States. So they're cutting back on contributions not to the UN first, but also to climate change and other commitments. I mean, they have come. It's completely kind of made U-turns in their policies on various issues. There is a complete denial of climate change now coming. So I think yes, the challenges to that extent get multiplied when the leading player, a leading global player like the United States is not on board, and it's in fact pulling in the opposite direction in many cases. But having said that, it remains important for the UN as a body, as a collective, to express the opinion, and as long as there is the will, the political will can be mustered. I mean, this we have seen is lacking both in terms of the reform of the multilateral organizations, in terms of the peacekeeping operations, cutting back on finances, the climate agenda. So all these, yes, require commitment from all the globe, but that is the way the multilateral system works. I mean, you have to express your political will, and in this case, India's stature and standing with 1.4 billion people clearly stating its objectives carry weight. Of course, what will actually happen on the ground will depend on how all the countries respond. Another thing I wanted to point out with regard, there was very clear messages in his statement to different countries. Of course, the terrorism message to the neighbors, where he said one neighbor has been the epicenter, and to the whole world that India will have zero tolerance. There was also the message to the United States with regard to trade and these tariffs and things like that. There was also the, I think, a message to the Chinese, for example, by saying that, denial of or disruption of supply chains and critical minerals. So I think they were very nuanced, of course, without naming any country, as it's not the practice to name countries. But I think the messages would not have been lost on the audiences for which they were meant.
Well, certainly, and it is always important to put one's point across when such gatherings take place. This is an annual event, and the world gathers to listen to each other, to try and get their messages across to each other as well, apart from making an effort to come together collectively to address global issues. So there you have it. That was India's take through our External Affairs Minister at the 80th UNGA this time around. Thank you so much for joining us to talk about it, Ambassador Mukul, and thank you, Amrit, to you as well. And with that, it's a wrap in this edition of DD India Live. For all the latest, keep watching DD India.